when renowned paranormal investigators, Dr. Julian Marks and Professor Lila Bennett, received a letter inviting them to investigate the notorious Ashford Manor. They couldn't resist the challenge. The sprawling, decaying mansion had been abandoned for over a century, its dark past shrouded in mystery and death. Rumors of ghostly apparitions, sudden disappearances, and eerie sounds had kept the locals at bay, making the manor an ideal case for the two seasoned investigators. As they approached Ashford Manor, the sky was already darkening, casting long shadows over the decrepit structure. The mansion loomed against the backdrop of the dying sun, its windows shattered, and its once grand facade marred by tides of neglect. The air around it felt heavy, thick with an almost tangible sense of foreboding. "This place feels alive," Layla muttered, adjusting the strap of her equipment bag as they made their way up the overgrown path. Julian nodded, his expression unreadable. "We've dealt with haunted locations before, but this one, it feels different." The front door creaked open with an ominous groan as they pushed their way inside. The grand entrance hall was dimly lit by the fading light, the air thick with dust and the smell of damp wood. Faded portraits of the Ashford family lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow the intruders as they stepped into the house. The duo set up their equipment quickly, placing cameras in strategic locations throughout the manor. EMF meters, digital recorders, and infrared sensors were all deployed to capture any signs of paranormal activity. They had been doing this for years, long enough to know that patience was key. But tonight, there was an unsettling sense of urgency in the air, as if the house itself was waiting for them. By midnight, the manor was cloaked in darkness, the only sounds being the creaking of the old house and the occasional rustle of wind through the broken windows. The investigators began their vigil, moving from room to room, asking questions and listening for responses. The house remained silent, but there was a sense of being watched, a prickling at the back of their necks that kept them on edge. Around 2 a.m., they entered the manor's drawing room, a once lavish space now overtaken by decay. As Julian scanned the room with his infrared camera, he noticed a cold spot near the fireplace. "Lila, over here," he called, his voice barely above a whisper. Lila joined him, holding up her EMF meter, which immediately began to spike. The temperature around them dropped rapidly, their breath visible in the cold air. Lila activated the spirit box, a device designed to capture electronic voice phenomena, EVP, and began to ask questions. "Is there anyone here with us?" she asked, her voice steady despite the growing tension. For a long moment, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, a voice emerged from the white noise. "Leave. Now." Julian and Lila exchanged a glance. They had heard responses before, but this voice was different. It was filled with malice, a deep, guttural tone that sent chills down their spines. "Who are you?" Julian asked, gripping the recorder tightly. There was a pause, and then the voice responded, clearer this time. "Trapped. Cursed. Leave." The room suddenly felt oppressive, the walls seeming to close in on them. The temperature continued to drop, and the EMF meter spiked wildly, indicating a strong paranormal presence. The investigators began to feel a pressure in their chests, a suffocating force that made it difficult to breathe. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the manor, as if something massive had fallen. They both jumped, their nerves on edge. "What the hell was that?" Lila exclaimed, her heart pounding in her chest, "Let's find out," Julian replied, though his voice betrayed his unease. They followed the sound down the narrow hallway, the darkness around them thick and almost tangible. As they reached the end of the corridor, they saw that the door to the basement had been flung open, revealing a set of stairs descending into the pitch-black depths of the house. "We have to go down there, don't we?" Lila whispered, already knowing the answer. Julian nodded grimly. "We came here to find the truth. We can't turn back now." With flashlights in hand, they descended the creaking stairs, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The basement was damp and cold, the air heavy with the stench of mold and decay. As they reached the bottom, their flashlights revealed a large, circular room with a strange, almost ritualistic symbol carved into the stone floor. In the center of the room stood an ancient, rotting wooden table, covered in dust and cobwebs. Upon the table was a large, blackened mirror, its surface cracked and mottled. The mirror seemed to absorb the light from their flashlights, reflecting nothing back at them. Julian's heart raced as he approached the table, a deep sense of dread settling over him. The mirror seemed to pulse with a dark energy, an overwhelming sense of despair emanating from its depths. He hesitated, then reached out to touch the mirror's surface. The moment his fingers brushed against the cold glass, the room was plunged into darkness. The flashlights flickered and died, leaving them in complete blackness. The air grew thick, and a low, guttural growl filled the room, reverberating off the walls. Lila grabbed Julian's arm, her voice shaking. "We need to get out of here now." Before they could move, a voice echoed through the darkness. The same voice they had heard through the spirit box, only now it was all around them, deafening in its intensity. "You are mine!" The darkness pressed in on them, and the cold intensified, until it was unbearable. Julian and Lila struggled to move, but it felt as if an invisible force was holding them in place. The growl grew louder, more menacing, and they could feel a presence moving closer, surrounding them. Out of the corner of his eye, Julian saw something moving in the darkness, shadows twisting and writhing, taking shape. A figure stepped out of the void, a grotesque, distorted silhouette with glowing red eyes and a mouth twisted into a sinister grin. The figure reached out, its long, skeletal fingers stretching towards them. Lila screamed as the fingers wrapped around her, pulling her towards the darkness. Julian tried to grab her, but the force holding him back was too strong. "Julian, help me!" Lila cried out, her voice filled with terror. But before he could do anything, the darkness swallowed her whole, her screams echoing through the basement until they abruptly cut off, leaving Julian in suffocating silence. Panicked and desperate, Julian fought against the force holding him, mustering all his strength to break free. Finally, he stumbled backward, crashing into the stone wall. The impact knocked the air out of him, but the force released its grip, and he scrambled to his feet. Without a second thought, Julian bolted up the stairs, not daring to look back. The growl followed him, echoing through the walls as he sprinted towards the entrance hall. As he burst through the front door and into the night, he heard the manor's door slam shut behind him with a resounding finality. Breathing heavily, Julian collapsed onto the overgrown path outside, his heart pounding in his chest. He was safe, but Lila was gone, lost to whatever malevolent force haunted Ashford Manor. The sun began to rise as Julian sat there, staring at the decrepit mansion. He knew he couldn't leave her there, but he also knew that if he returned, he might never escape. The legend of Ashford Manor was real, and the house had claimed another soul. As the first rays of light pierced the darkness, Julian made his decision. He would return to the manor with more help,
more equipment. He would uncover the truth of what happened to Lila and put an end to the curse that bound the spirits to this accursed place. But deep down, as he looked at the ominous silhouette of Ashford Manor, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was waiting for him to return, and that when he did, it would be the last mistake he ever made.
Briarwood Manor had stood at the edge of town for over a century, its tall Gothic spires looming ominously against the darkened sky. The house was a monument to a bygone era, its grand halls and ornate rooms once the envy of the region. But now, it was nothing more than a decaying relic, shrouded in mystery and fear. No one in the small town of Ashford dared to venture too close to the old mansion, especially after sundown. The stories of what happened within those walls were enough to keep even the bravest souls away. The manor had been uninhabited for decades, ever since the tragic events that had unfolded there. In the early 1900s, the mansion had been home to the Whitmore family, wealthy industrialists who had amassed a fortune in the steel industry. They were well respected in the community, known for their philanthropy and grand parties. But beneath the surface, the family was plagued by dark secrets and a string of mysterious deaths that culminated in a night of terror that would be spoken of in hushed tones for generations. The tale began when the youngest Whitmore daughter, Eleanor, fell gravely ill. Despite the best efforts of doctors, her condition worsened rapidly, and she passed away in her sleep. Her death marked the beginning of a series of strange occurrences in the house, doors slamming shut on their own, footsteps echoing through empty hallways, and the chilling sound of a child's laughter reverberating through the manor at odd hours. The family became increasingly paranoid, convinced that Eleanor's spirit was trapped within the house. In a desperate attempt to rid the manor of the ghost, the Whitmores enlisted the help of a renowned medium. The seance was held in the grand dining room, where Eleanor had spent many happy moments with her family. As the medium called out to the spirit, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the flames of the candles flickered wildly. The medium's voice grew strained as she made contact with something dark and malevolent. Suddenly, the table shook violently, and the room was filled with a deafening roar. The seance was abruptly cut short, leaving the family terrified and the medium shaken to her core. That night, the entire Whitmore family vanished without a trace. The only clue to their fate was a single bloody handprint on the wall of the dining room, too small to belong to any of the adults. The townspeople searched the house and the surrounding woods, but the family was never found. The mansion was abandoned, left to rot, with only the memory of that dreadful night lingering in the air. Years passed, and the story of Briarwood Manor became the stuff of legend. Most believed that the mansion was cursed, and the Whitmores had been claimed by whatever malevolent force resided within. The house remained untouched until a young couple, Sarah and Tom, moved to Ashford and bought the manor at an auction. Drawn to its historical charm and the opportunity to restore it to its former glory, they were warned by the townspeople to stay away, but Sarah and Tom dismissed the tales as nothing more than superstitious nonsense. Excited to start a new chapter of their lives, they moved into Briarwood Manor. Eager to begin the renovations, the first few weeks were uneventful, and the couple quickly settled into their new home. But as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, strange things began to happen. It started with small, easily dismissible events. The sound of creaking floorboards when no one was walking, doors that seemed to close by themselves, and the occasional cold draft that sent shivers down their spines. Sarah began to feel an unexplainable unease, as if she were constantly being watched. Tom assured her it was just her imagination, but deep down, he felt it too. One evening, while they were unpacking in the attic, Sarah stumbled upon an old, dusty journal tucked away in a forgotten corner. The leather-bound book was worn and brittle, its pages yellowed with age. Intrigued, she opened it and began to read. It was the diary of Eleanor Whitmore, the young girl who had died so many years ago. The entries started out innocently enough, detailing her daily life and the activities she enjoyed. But as Sarah read on, the tone of the diary changed, becoming darker and more erratic. Eleanor wrote of strange visions, of shadowy figures that appeared in her room at night, whispering her name. She described the growing sense of dread that consumed her, the feeling that something evil was lurking just beyond the edge of her perception. The final entry was a frantic scrawl, barely legible. "They're coming for me. I can hear them. Please, someone, help me." As Sarah finished reading, she felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. She spun around, but the attic was empty. Her heart raced as she hurried down the stairs, clutching the diary tightly. When she showed it to Tom, he dismissed it as a relic of a tragic past. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. That night, Sarah was jolted awake by the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the hallway. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. Tom was still asleep beside her, oblivious to the noise. She strained to listen, the laughter growing louder and more distorted, as if it were coming from multiple directions at once. She cautiously got out of bed and crept towards the door, her breath hitching with each step. As she reached the hallway, the laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. The air was thick and oppressive, pressing down on her from all sides. Suddenly, a shadow darted across the corner of her vision. She whipped around, but there was nothing there, only the long, dark corridor stretching out before her. Sarah's pulse quickened as she slowly made her way down the hallway, drawn by an inexplicable force towards the grand dining room. The room was dark, the only light coming from the pale moonlight filtering through the tall windows. As she stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply, her breath visible in the frigid air. In the center of the room, she saw it. The small, bloody handprint on the wall, just as the townspeople had described. Her stomach turned as she realized the mark was fresh, the blood still glistening. She backed away, her legs trembling, but her retreat was halted by a sudden gust of wind that slammed the door shut behind her. Panic set in as Sarah tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room grew darker, the shadows lengthening and twisting into grotesque shapes. The sound of footsteps echoed through the room, growing louder and closer. She turned to see a figure emerging from the darkness, a little girl, her eyes hollow and black, her dress stained with blood. "Help me," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah's scream caught in her throat as the figure advanced, her movements jerky and unnatural. The child's face twisted into a grotesque smile as she reached out a hand towards Sarah. But before the girl could touch her, the shadows around them surged forward, enveloping the child and pulling her back into the darkness. The room was filled with an ear-splitting roar, and Sarah felt herself being lifted off her feet, her body hurled across the room. She hit the wall with a bone-rattling thud, her vision blurring as she slumped to the floor. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness
was the little girl's face, twisted in a silent scream as the shadows consumed her. When Sarah awoke, she was lying in her bed, drenched in sweat. The morning light streamed through the window, the events of the night before seeming like a distant nightmare. But when she looked at her hands, she saw them, small specks of blood, just like the ones on the wall. Terrified, Sarah tried to convince Tom to leave Briarwood Manor, but he refused, dismissing her fears as nothing more than bad dreams. But Sarah knew better. She could feel the presence in the house, growing stronger, feeding off their fear. The nights became more unbearable, with the laughter, the whispers, and the shadows closing in on them. Finally, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She packed her bags and left, driving as far away from the manor as she could. But even as she put miles between herself and the house, she couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed her. The shadows clung to her, the whispers echoing in her ears, no matter where she went. Tom stayed behind, determined to finish the renovations. But as the days passed, the townspeople noticed a change in him. He became reclusive, his once cheerful demeanor replaced by a hollow, vacant expression. And then, one day, he too disappeared, just like the Whitmores all those years ago. Briarwood Manor still stands at the edge of town, its darkened windows staring out like empty eyes. The locals avoid it at all costs, whispering tales of the haunted house and the spirits that linger within its walls. But the truth is far more terrifying. Once you enter Briarwood Manor, you never truly leave. The house claims you, body and soul, trapping you in its twisted, nightmarish embrace forever.
Deep in the heart of Blackwood Forest lies a small, forgotten village named Thornhill. Once a thriving community, Thornhill was abandoned nearly a century ago under mysterious circumstances. The village is now nothing more than a collection of decaying houses and overgrown paths, swallowed by the forest. Yet, despite its dereliction, a dark presence lingers, haunting the ruins and anyone who dares to venture too close. The legend of Thornhill is well known to the locals of the surrounding towns. They speak of the village in hushed tones, warning travelers to steer clear of the area, especially after sunset. The most chilling tale is that of the Specter of Blackwood Forest, a vengeful spirit said to wander the woods, seeking retribution for the wrongs done to her in life. The story begins with a woman named Eliza Crawford, who lived in Thornhill in the late 1800s. Eliza was known for her beauty and kindness, beloved by all who knew her. However, her life took a tragic turn when her husband, William, died in a hunting accident, leaving her alone with their newborn son, Samuel. Heartbroken and struggling to provide for her child, Eliza became increasingly isolated. She spent her days wandering the forest, collecting herbs and roots to sell at the market. But as time passed, rumors began to spread about Eliza's strange behavior. Some claimed to see her speaking to unseen figures in the woods, while others reported hearing her weeping at night, her cries echoing through the trees. The villagers grew fearful, believing that Eliza had turned to witchcraft to cope with her grief. Their suspicions were fueled by the sudden illnesses that began to plague Thornhill. Crops failed, livestock died, and children fell ill with strange, unexplainable ailments. Desperate for answers, the villagers blamed Eliza, accusing her of cursing the village. On a cold, moonless night, the villagers gathered at Eliza's cottage, torches in hand. They demanded that she confess to her crimes and lift the curse. But Eliza, holding her son in her arms, denied any wrongdoing. Enraged, the mob dragged her into the forest, ignoring her pleas for mercy. They tied her to a tree and set fire to the ground around her, believing that by destroying her, they would cleanse the village of her dark influence. As the flames consumed her, Eliza cursed the villagers with her dying breath. She vowed that she would return to exact revenge on those who had wronged her, and that her spirit would haunt the forest for all eternity. Moments before she succumbed to the fire, she whispered one final word: Samuel. The next morning, the villagers returned to the spot where Eliza had been burned, but there was no trace of her body. Only the charred remains of the tree stood as a grim reminder of their actions. That same day, Eliza's cottage was found empty, her son Samuel gone without a trace. Despite a thorough search of the forest, the boy was never found. Shortly after, the strange occurrences in Thornhill intensified. The villagers began to experience terrifying apparitions. Eliza's ghost, wreathed in flames, appeared at the edge of the forest, her eyes burning with fury. Crops withered overnight, wells ran dry, and the air was filled with the stench of decay. Those who ventured into the forest never returned, and the villagers soon realized that Eliza's curse had doomed them all. One by one, the inhabitants of Thornhill fled, leaving the village to rot. But even in their new homes, they found no escape from the specter's wrath. Fires broke out in their houses, and their children fell ill with the same mysterious ailments that had plagued the village. The few who survived told tales of a woman's voice calling to them in the night, urging them to return to Blackwood Forest. Over the years, Thornhill was forgotten, its story fading into legend. But the curse remained, and the Specter of Blackwood Forest continued to haunt the area. Hikers and campers who ventured too close to the ruins reported seeing a ghostly figure moving among the trees, her eyes glowing with an unearthly light. Those who ignored the warnings and entered the forest were often found dead, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions, as if they had been pursued by something unspeakable. One summer, a group of college students decided to investigate the legend for a class project. Skeptical of the supernatural, they were eager to debunk the myths surrounding Thornhill. Armed with cameras and recording equipment, they ventured into Blackwood Forest, determined to uncover the truth. The first night passed uneventfully, with the group setting up camp near the edge of the village. They explored the ruins, documenting their findings and dismissing the eerie atmosphere as nothing more than overactive imaginations. But as night fell, the mood shifted. The air grew heavy, and an unnatural silence settled over the forest. The students began to hear faint whispers, indistinct and distant, yet unmistakably human. One by one, they experienced strange occurrences: sound of footsteps in the underbrush, the rustling of leaves with no wind to move them, and the fleeting glimpse of a shadowy figure at the edge of their vision. As the night wore on, the group's skepticism gave way to fear, and they huddled together in the center of the camp, too afraid to venture into the darkness. In the early hours of the morning, the temperature plummeted, and a thick mist rolled in, obscuring their surroundings. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the students realized with horror that they were not alone. The ghost of Eliza Crawford had returned, drawn by their presence, and she was not pleased. The mist thickened, swallowing the light of their lanterns and plunging them into darkness. Panic set in as the students scrambled to find each other, their voices drowned out by the deafening roar of the wind. But no matter how hard they tried, they could not escape the forest.
The trees seemed to close in around them, twisting and warping, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. One by one, the students were separated, their screams echoing through the forest as they were claimed by the specter. When the sun rose, the forest was still once more. The mist lifted to reveal the bodies of the students lying in the clearing, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The footage from their cameras was later recovered by a search party. It showed the group's initial exploration of the village, followed by chaotic, disjointed images of the mist and the shadowy figure that pursued them. But the most disturbing footage was the final moments, when the camera was dropped to the ground, capturing the sound of a woman's voice, cold and hollow, whispering, "You should never have come." The legend of Thornhill and the Specter of Blackwood Forest remains a cautionary tale, a reminder that some places are best left undisturbed. Those who ignore the warnings and venture into the forest may find themselves face to face with the vengeful spirit of Eliza Crawford, doomed to share her fate for all eternity.